About 4 years ago, my friend Gretchen and I were on a long bicycle trip all the way from Miami, Florida up to St. Agatha, Maine. Now, on the sixth day of our trip, we decided to spend the night in Florence, South Carolina. We were there because Gretchen was friends with some nurses from the Florence Medical Center, and we decided to meet up with them at a local bar called the Jazz on Darden. Now, we did our introductions and then had a drink, and then after a few jazz standards from the band, a nurse named Tom turned to me and said, "So you do ethics, right?" I said that I did. Then he said, "Well, we've got an ethics question for you." So apparently at that time, there was a doctor at their hospital named Dr. Buck Bennis, who was a nightmare to work with. Now, Dr. Bennis was a genius, and nobody doubted that. But he had a couple of really bad habits. So one thing he did was he would steal supplies from the hospital. It started small. He would steal a pencil here and a stapler there. But then it progressed. Now he was stealing money from the wallets of his patients when they were asleep. And he would be also stealing OxyContin from the pharmacy. He did it once after pulling a fire alarm. Now, to make matters worse, Dr. Bennis liked doing acid, and after a really bad trip, he stopped believing that vaccines are in any way useful for preventing viruses. The nurses suspected, but they couldn't prove, that Dr. Bennis had actually been teaching anti-vax propaganda to his patients and then falsifying their vaccination records. And in addition, kind of the cherry on top was that he was very verbally abusive to his staff, and he would insult them and viciously do so anytime they were slower than him in finding a diagnosis. And they often were, because Dr. Bennis was a genius despite his failings. Now, Tom finished telling me the story of Dr. Bennis, and then another nurse named Emily looked at me and said, "So that's what's going on. Do you think that maybe you can help us figure out what to do? I think that we should talk to the hospital administrator and tell her what's going on. Tom thinks that we should go to the press, because if we don't do that, we might get fired." Beatrice doesn't want to do anything, though. Now, Beatrice is 2 months from retirement. She has a sick child to take care of, and she doesn't want to get involved in any drama that could get her fired before she retires. At this point, I looked over at Beatrice, and I saw her mutter over her glass of whiskey, "I'm getting too old for this shit." So at that point, I had a lot of questions, and I had very few answers. One thing I was wondering was, when's it morally permissible to blow the whistle on the bad behavior of others in one's organization? Must one exhaust internal reporting mechanisms before going to the press? Is one ever morally obligated to blow the whistle, such that one does something morally wrong by not blowing the whistle? So I told Emily, Tom, and Beatrice, and the others that I needed to think these questions over before I could offer them anything. Gretchen wanted to stay at the bar and catch up some more, but I went outside to go take a walk. Now, a good first step in thinking about whistleblowing or any other moral issues is to clarify the terms of the debate. In this case, there's 4 terms that are incredibly helpful. So, number 1, negative duties. Number 2, positive duties. 3, negative rights. And 4, positive rights. So let's go through those in that order. So, doctors are not supposed to steal money from their sleeping patients. And this proscription expresses a negative duty which Dr. Bennis violated. Now, it's an obligation to not do something. That's what a negative duty is. On the other hand, doctors also have an obligation to provide a high quality of medical care to their patients. This prescription expresses what's called a positive duty. It's an obligation to do something. By not vaccinating his patients, Dr. Bennis violated this positive duty. So we have negative duties and we have positive duties so far. But let's talk about rights. So when a patient comes into a hospital, they have a right, in most cases, to refuse treatment. And what this means is that there's a sphere of inviolability around the patient that nurses, doctors, and other healthcare providers are not allowed to violate. So this is an example of what's called a negative right. It's a right against healthcare providers, and it says that in most cases, healthcare providers cannot provide treatment to a patient without the patient's consent. Patients also, so that's a negative right, right? Negative rights, we're talking about these spheres of inviolability. But in addition to that, there's also positive rights. So if I show up at a hospital, I expect to receive a high quality of care. I expect to receive high quality medical treatment. Now, this expectation is not simply a prediction, like a presidential election forecast. I am owed high quality medical treatment. I have a positive right, in other words, to receive this high quality of medical treatment. So that's what a positive right is. Positive right says that I'm owed something. Now, in general, negative rights and negative duties are more stringent than positive rights and positive duties. So just to make this really concrete, suppose Gretchen and I are sitting, resting beside a highway. She has a negative duty to not push me into traffic, and I have a negative right against her that she not push me into traffic. But suppose that we come across a person who has been struck by a car. It's plausible that we have a positive duty to render aid, but it also seems like we have significant discretion over how we offer that aid. At a minimum, we should call an ambulance, but it's not clear whether we're obligated to wait until the ambulance arrives. Maybe Gretchen had a traumatic experience in her recent past and cannot yet stand the sight of blood. If that's the case, I don't think we'd blame her for calling an ambulance from a distance rather than rushing over to the scene of the accident and assessing the victim's wounds and creating a tourniquet, right? So the negative duties and the negative rights are often more stringent. They're generally more stringent than the positive duties and the positive rights. So one thing that you'll notice is that the rights and duties often go together. So Dr. Bennis's negative duty to not steal money from sleeping patients corresponds to a patient's negative right to not have their property stolen from them while they're asleep in a hospital. In addition, it's generally much simpler to pass laws that punish violations of negative rights and duties than to pass laws that punish failures to perform positive duties and positive rights. A law that prohibits Gretchen from pushing me into traffic is a morally good law. But there are serious moral objections to passing a law that would punish someone for failing to render aid to an injured person whom one simply happens to come across. One reason why is that such a law could pass an undue burden on passersby. You're walking along, going along your business, maybe you have something incredibly important to do. If you're not really careful in passing one of these Good Samaritan laws that make it illegal to not render aid, you're going to now place a really strong burden on somebody. You're going to make it the case that no matter what you're doing, perhaps, all of a sudden you've been drafted into a situation where you need to render aid. So that's a basic framework of positive and negative duties and rights. Now we're going to apply it to whistleblowing. So far when I've talked about negative and positive duties in the context of the nurses' stories, I've talked about them in the context of Dr. Buck Bennis's treatment of his patients. We also need to talk about the positive and negative duties and rights in the context of blowing the whistle on Dr. Buck Bennis. And let's begin with Tom's suggestion that the nurses go to the press, and we'll call this external whistleblowing. So, what are some of the duties and rights that exist in this context? Well, one really clear duty is a duty to the hospital. So, Emily, Beatrice, and Tom, and the others have a positive duty to look out for the interests of the hospital. And they also have a negative duty to not, as the saying goes, air the dirty laundry of the hospital at the slightest provocation. So I think that we should all agree that they're doing something wrong if any time they have the slightest disagreement with anything that one of their bosses says, they just go right to the press, right? They owe the hospital more than that. They owe the hospital more than just to, at the slightest provocation, run off to the press. So that's one positive duty. There's another one, though, and this is a conflicting duty, and this is duty to the public. So I think they have a positive duty to warn the community of Florence, South Carolina about Dr. Buck Bennis's bad behavior. If Dr. Buck Bennis is going around killing patients, clearly they should warn somebody about that. This case is not quite as severe. He's not killing them, but he's just robbing them when they're asleep. But that still seems like a really serious violation of the patient's rights. And it seems like they have a positive duty to warn the public about that. There's a third duty, though, and this is the duty that Beatrice points out. They have a duty to themselves and to their families. Now, there's a writer, C. Fred Alford, and in 2001, he did a little some research on what happens to people after they engage in whistleblowing. I'm going to read you a quotation from that, page 19. He writes, "Of the several dozen whistleblowers I have talked with, most lost their homes. Many lost their families. It doesn't happen all at once, but whistleblowers' cases drag on for years, putting a tremendous strain on families. Most whistleblowers will suffer from depression and alcoholism, and half the ones that he surveyed went bankrupt. Most whistleblowers will be unable to retire. A typical fate is for a nuclear engineer to end up selling computers at Radio Shack." Now, for those of you who don't know, Radio Shack used to be a place where you could go and buy electronics. So, what we need is a plausible compromise between these different duties that pull in very different directions. These duties that pull in the direction of looking out for the interests of the hospital, looking out for the interests of the public, and looking out for the interests of oneself and one's family. And I think a really good place to start comes from a really famous, one of the most influential moral theories of whistleblowing from Richard DeGeorge's 1986 textbook, Business Ethics. So DeGeorge identifies 3 conditions that must be satisfied in order for it to be morally permissible for an employee to engage in external whistleblowing. And again, by external whistleblowing, what I'm talking about is going and blowing the whistle to the public, to a journalist, to some institution that exists outside of the corporation itself, or in this case, the hospital. So DeGeorge's first condition is that the company needs to be doing something that is seriously harmful to others through either its actions or its policies. And this makes sense. If your boss just kind of gives you a dirty look and you go run to the press and, you make a big deal out of that, it seems like that is quite excessive. It needs to be the case that something really bad is going on that you're blowing the whistle on. So that's the first condition. Second condition is that the employee must first report the harm to their immediate supervisors. And this also makes sense. If I'm working on an assembly line and I notice that one of my coworkers is writing nasty messages with pen on the components that are going into people's cars, I should probably just tell my immediate supervisor before I run to the press about that. Now, what happens if my immediate supervisor doesn't do anything about it? So this is where the third condition comes in. So the third condition is that if the employee's immediate superior does not effectively address the issue, the employee must then use the internal reporting procedures within the firm to the extent that doing so is feasible. So, suppose we go back to the assembly line case and I report it to my superior. She doesn't do anything. I go up the chain of command. I talk to her boss. Her boss doesn't do anything. I talk to her boss. Her boss doesn't do anything. I go all the way up to the top. But let's suppose that nobody does anything. At this point, it's now morally permissible for the employee to blow the whistle to an outside source like the press. So let's go back to the hospital case with the nurses. Now, the first of DeGeorge's criteria is clearly met. The hospital, through Dr. Buck Bennis, clearly presents a harm to the public. But are the next 2 criteria met? They're not met until the nurses make a good faith effort to use the internal reporting mechanism. So let's suppose, for instance, that, I'm out here taking a walk. I go back into the bar and I go, hey, nurses, Emily, Beatrice, Tom, did you make a good faith effort, or are you considering making a good faith effort to use the internal reporting mechanism? And what they tell me is that everybody in the hierarchy is so terrified of Dr. Buck Bennis that there is no feasible path through internal reporting mechanisms that result in the curtailment of his behavior. So, on this assumption, the nurses are permitted, according to DeGeorge, to blow the whistle. And I want to pause on this for a second, because one way that DeGeorge often gets misinterpreted by commentators in the business ethics literature is that they'll claim that DeGeorge's conditions are too stringent. They'll claim that according to DeGeorge, you need to use internal reporting mechanisms before you can go to the police. Oh, sorry, not the police, the public, the press, right? And often people will claim things like DeGeorge's criteria are not effective in cases of sexual harassment. When, the people doing, like sort of the people up there in the chain of command are the ones doing the sexual harassment. And I think that the commentators who make this charge against DeGeorge are just mistaken. They've just failed to understand the full utility of DeGeorge's theory, because he does make it absolutely clear in at least the later editions of his business ethics textbooks that it needs to be feasible. And if it's not feasible to go up the chain of command, then you don't need to do that. So on this understanding, on this correct understanding of DeGeorge's criteria, unlike the ones that you often see in the literature, it is permissible for the nurses to go and blow the whistle at this point. So there I am. I've just sat back down at the table. I've just told them, yeah, it is permissible for you to go and blow the whistle if it's really as you've described it. And then Beatrice says to me, she says, okay, but do I have to do it? Do I have to do it? Am I obligated to do it? Is it a moral requirement that I blow the whistle? Now, as with the question of permissibility, the question of whether there's a requirement to blow the whistle also involves trade-offs. So just kind of reviewing the positive, negative duties and rights that we talked about earlier, the nurses do have a positive duty to inform the public about Dr. Bennis, but they also have a positive duty to themselves and to their families to avoid putting themselves and their livelihoods at risk. So what should we tell Beatrice? I think it's, again, instructive to go back and look at DeGeorge's text. So DeGeorge gives us two additional conditions for not mere permissibility, but for requirement. So the first condition is that the employee has convincing evidence that they are correct in their assessment of the harm posed by the company. And the second condition is that the act of blowing the whistle is likely to bring about good results that outweigh the harms to the whistleblower. So in other words, the expected benefit outweighs the expected costs. Now, both these conditions make a lot of sense. If you have a really strong hunch that there's some misconduct going on, it seems like that's not going to be enough to convince the jury of public opinion, the court of public opinion, that misconduct has happened. You got to have some convincing evidence. And the second thing is you need to be at least pretty sure that the whistleblowing is going to have a good effect. If you think that blowing the whistle is merely going to, ruffle a few feathers and people will be a little bit upset for a while, then nothing's actually going to happen, but it's going to result in the loss of your livelihood, your family, and your house, it seems like it would be way too stringent a requirement to say that you're obligated to blow the whistle in that context. So these latter two conditions from DeGeorge do a good job of accommodating both of those intuitions. So in this case, here I am sitting at the table at the bar talking to Beatrice, Tom, and Emily. It's not clear to me what sort of evidence the nurses have. So I asked them, I say, you say that you suspect, but you can't prove that Dr. Bennis is peddling anti-vaccination propaganda, right? And they respond and they say, yeah, we can't prove it, but we suspect it. So what we can say to Beatrice now is you don't have an obligation to blow the whistle on that charge. You don't have good enough evidence for it. Maybe, Emily, if you can go in there and kind of get a smoking gun, if you can find patients who will testify that Dr. Buck Bennis has falsified their vaccination records and peddled anti-vaccination propaganda to them while, working with them, then you're probably, that might tip the scale and make it so that you have enough evidence. But as it stands, you don't. But suppose that Emily then says that she has video footage of Dr. Buck Bennis stealing from a sleeping patient and the pharmacy. Now the first condition has been satisfied, right? So Emily says that, now the first condition is satisfied. And in fact, in the story, that's how it went. She did in fact say that. So the first condition is satisfied. How about the second one? So I ask her, I say, Emily, do you think that if you go to the press, they're going to run the story? And do you think that if they run the story, it's going to have an impact? She pauses for a second and says, yes, I do think so. I'm fairly good friends with a journalist over at the local paper. I think that if I talk to them, they're going to run the story. And what's more, there was some whistleblowing a couple of years ago, and a doctor ended up getting fired. The hospital administrator is actually really sensitive to these kinds of stories, especially if I have some evidence of the stealing from the pharmacy. So, it's like, okay. But what's it going to do to you? What's it going to be like for you? And she says, well, I can get another job. Actually, I'm looking at another job offer from another hospital, and I actually know the hospital administrator. And I know that if I blow the whistle and there's retaliation against me, I'm going to still get this other job. It's going to be okay for me. It seems like both of the Georgia's criteria are satisfied. And because of that she actually has an obligation to blow the whistle. Given the serious charges against Dr. Buck Bennis, given this serious threat to public safety that Dr. Bennis poses, and given the fact that it really looks like her whistleblowing is going to be effective, and that the effect on her is not going to be that severe, it seems like she really needs to do it. And that if she doesn't do it, she's failing in some important moral obligation. Beatrice, on the other hand, things are a little bit different. Beatrice may not have an obligation to blow the whistle because for her and her family, the costs are going to be much more significant. Now, the Georgia's account is not universally acknowledged as the be-all, end-all account of whistleblowing, but I do think that's an excellent account to use if you want to orient yourself in the debate. Because what it can help you do is it can help you see that any plausible account of whistleblowing is going to involve trade-offs between a rich set of duties and rights associated with a variety of different stakeholders. There's the public, there's the employees, there's the families of the employees, and there's the corporation itself. And here's where I'm going to leave off. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to evaluate the Georgia's criteria and possibly come up with a new set of criteria on your own. So I want you to take a real-life case of corporate misconduct or misconduct in some other arena, and I want you to see how good of a job the Georgia's criteria do at determining whether the conduct of a whistleblower is impermissible, merely permissible, or required. So here's one such case, and this comes from 2013. So Edward Snowden leaked classified documents from the National Security Agency to Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian and some other newspapers and other journalists. Now, these documents revealed a massive surveillance infrastructure that was far more invasive than anyone outside of government intelligence agencies could have predicted. Snowden took a lot of safeguards. First, he attempted to use internal reporting mechanisms to raise ethical concerns with the state of mass surveillance, but these attempts failed. Snowden also made it really clear that he wanted the journalists to exercise their discretion with respect to which documents they released. And one thing that The Guardian has done is they've made it so that anytime they're about to release a document, they let the NSA weigh in and talk to them first to sort of make the case that these things shouldn't be released. So they really are taking, they're really trying to take the harms to the government and to national security and to the public at large very seriously. But take a look at Snowden. Right now, Snowden has been charged with 3 felonies, and it's unlikely that he's ever going to be able to return home to the United States. So were Snowden's actions permissible? Were they required? Or would a Georgia's verdict be? And is that verdict correct?